Good morning. So glad that you guys came to join us this morning here at Lawnville Road Church of Christ. And it's good to be back. It's been a long summer so far, but we're happy to be back. But I believe after tonight's service, we'll be leaving again for a week, and then we'll be back once school begins. This morning, we want to welcome Eleanor and Pauline, who are at home watching the broadcast. We encourage everyone to tell others about the broadcast that we have, that if they're not able to come to our services, to tell people they can watch it online at home. And so we welcome them this morning, and come back to us soon. We're so encouraged to have others who can't be with us, that they're still willing to worship and still willing to listen to the sermon this morning. So we're glad to have them. But I have a question for you. Why are you here? This morning we're going to be dealing with concerning why we're here, what is our purpose for being here, but what brings you to Lawnville this morning? What will bring you back tonight, this evening? What will bring you back on Wednesday? For all the times that the elders have set for us to come together, what brings you here? What will help bring you here? When you leave here this morning, I want you to have a better understanding of the chapter 10 in the book of Hebrews. That you would be able to do a Bible study with someone, that you in the future could explain to someone, give them a strong overview of chapter 10 of Hebrews and what it means to you and what it means to us as Christians. The book of Hebrews was written to Jewish Christians who were returning to Judaism because of the persecutions they faced for being Christians. So this is why it was written. The book of Hebrews encourages the Jewish Christian to remain faithful to the New Testament by showing them the insufficiency of the Old Testament, and the New Testament is a better and sufficient way. Hebrews 10 shows that the New Testament has a better message, has a better messenger. Chapter 1 of Hebrews is a better messenger. Chapters 3 through 4 is the rest. Chapter 5 through 7 is the priesthood and the high priest. And the chapters we'll be dealing with is on the sacrifice. Hebrews 10 shows how the sacrifice of the New Testament trumps the sacrifice of the Old Testament, what the proper response to the New Testament should be, the result for rejecting the sacrifice of the New Testament, and gives an encouraging invitation to remain steadfast in the faith. If you would, look at verses 1 through 4, which was so capably read for us this morning, but we'll read them again. For the law, since it says only a shadow of good things to come, and not the very form of things, can never by the same sacrifices, year by year, which they offer continually, make perfect those who draw near. Do you remember as a child, or you can see it in young children at the ages of 2 or 3, when the sun is at high noon, or if the moon is out, or if they're in their room and they have a lamp on, you can see your shadow. I used to make shadow figures on the wall. I can make a gorilla on the wall that if you looked at the image, it looked just like a gorilla. But it actually wasn't the substance. It wasn't my hand. It was just a shadow. And this is what this is saying here, that the Old Testament, the law of Moses, was a shadow of the things to come. It wasn't the actual substance. The substance was Jesus Christ. And then in verse 2 it says, otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered because the worshipers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have consciousness of sins? But in those sacrifices, there's a reminder of sins year by year. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Verse 2 shows us that the Old Testament sacrifices could never purge our conscience of sins. But it was actually a reminder in verse 3, year by year, of sin. Verse 4, it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. It's basically saying that this is insufficient. This is not good enough. God is not pleased with this. It could not satisfy the debt of our sin, of mankind. So God had prepared a sacrifice which would be sufficient to pay the debt of man's sin, the body of Jesus. Let's read verses 5 through 8. Therefore, when he comes into the world, he says, sacrifice and offering thou hast not desired, but a body thou hast prepared for me, in whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin, thou hast taken no pleasure. Then I said, this is Jesus, behold, I have come in the roll of a book, it is written of me, to do thy will, O God. Verse 8 is just a recap of this. After saying above, sacrifices and offerings and whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin, thou hast not desired. For sin thou hast not desired, nor hast thou taken pleasure in them, which are offered according to the law. Jesus came to do the will of God in verse 7. Through the offering of his body, God had prepared for him. He took away the first testament so that he could establish the New Testament. Verse 9 says, then he said, behold, I have come to do thy will. He takes away the first in order to establish the second. This is the will that Jesus did for God. This is God's will that Jesus did. Verse 10, by this we will have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. And every priest stands daily ministering and offering time after time the sacrifices which can never take away sins. But he, having offered one sacrifice for sins for all time, sat down at the right hand of God. Jesus' offering stands in contrast to the Old Testament. The priest under the Old Testament served daily, offering the same sacrifices, which could never take away sins. But Jesus offered one sacrifice for all sins. And by this sacrifice, he established the new covenant, wherein is forgiveness. Let's look at verses 16 through 18. This is the new covenant that I will make with them after those days, says the Lord. I will put my laws upon their heart and upon their mind. I will write them. He then says, and their sins and their lawless deeds I will remember no more. Now where there is forgiveness of these things, there is no longer any offering for sin. This is sufficient. Verses 1 through 8, there was an insufficient Old Testament system. Now there is a sufficient sacrifice, one that can take away sins. The next verses I want to look at are through 19, and this is our proper reaction. This is our response to this. This is why we come together. This is why we do good. Because of what Christ has done and how sufficient his sacrifice is in our lives. Verse 18 and 19, this is where we have forgiveness. God says, I will remember their sins no more. How easy or how difficult at times can it be to forgive someone and then forget about it? You know, some people struggle with forgiving people and then they say that, I can't forget about it. Well, God doesn't ask us to forget about it. But what God is saying here is, I will bring it to remembrance no more. Basically, once you've been forgiven because of this sufficient sacrifice, I won't bring it up again. And that's how we should forgive others. It's impossible to forget it, but we shouldn't bring it up anymore. We won't bring it to remembrance. And this is our proper response to what Christ has done. Look at verse 19. Since therefore, brethren, we have confidence to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way, which he inaugurated for us through the veil that is his flesh. And since we have a great high priest over the house of God, Through Jesus' sacrifice, he made a new and living way for us to enter the holiest by his blood. Since we have this way into the holiest in Jesus as our high priest over the house of God, there are certain reactions we should have to this testament. What Jesus did for us was great. It was good. I don't know if you've been to a restaurant lately or prepared a meal at home, but you have side dishes and then you have the main course. You have the good stuff. You have the meat and potatoes. And what I want us to think about with Christ and his sacrifice is that's the good stuff that we need to be remembering, that we need to be focused on. And the other part is for us. It's almost the lettuce, the side dish. That's our reaction. That's what we should do. So let's look at this. Verse 22. Let us draw near with a sincere heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. Let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds. We should be drawing near with a sincere heart, with confident faithfulness. We should be holding fast without wavering. We should be thinking about our brethren and taking them into consideration. We should be encouraging our brethren to love and to good works. What if we're not doing those things? Look at verse 25. Not forsaking our assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more, as you see the day drawing near. To forsake the assembly is not only to not just be here, but it is to be here and to not provoke someone to love and good works. That is to forsake the assembly. If you're here and you don't have the mindset to worship, remember Christ, and to look on your brethren and to encourage them to love and good works and deeds, then you are forsaking the assembly this morning. And that was the habit of some. As they see the day drawing near, what is the day? Is this the return of Christ? Look at chapter 9, verse 28. Chapter 9, verse 28. So Christ also, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, shall appear a second time for salvation, without reference to sin, to those who eagerly await him. Going back to chapter 10, verse 25, it could be that the ones that aren't remembering what Christ has done for them and eagerly awaiting him, not remembering the work of Christ in their lives, the sufficient sacrifice, and then eagerly awaiting that return, has caused discouragement in their lives. And so their habit is to discourage others. I believe one way that will help us to encourage others to love and good works is to remember what Christ has done for us and then to eagerly await his return, to look forward to it, to love his appearing. So when you see him or others in the future, when they see him, they will love it. They will look forward to it. They have been eagerly awaiting this. So if you're not doing that, is there a punishment for it? Is there something else that the individuals who are discouraging people in the assembly, what do they have to look forward to? Look at verse 26 and 27. For if we go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a certain terrifying expectation of judgment and the fury of a fire, which will consume the adversaries. If you reject the New Testament, you reject the sacrifice of the New Testament. The only sufficient sacrifice which can never take away sins. Since Jesus is the only sufficient sacrifice for sin, if you reject him, there is nothing left for you except two things. There's two things you have to look forward to. First is a fearful looking of judgment, and the second is fiery indignation. Verse 28, anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Verse 29, how much severe punishment do you think he will deserve who has trampled under the foot the Son of God and has regarded as unclean the blood of the covenant by which he has been sanctified and has insulted the Spirit of grace? There was a punishment in the law of Moses. And since it was insufficient, it wasn't as good as the new covenant, as the new law, the punishment increases. There's a stricter punishment now. There's a harsher punishment, more severe. Now, a person who has rejected Christ, who has become discouraged, who has forgot his work, they are now discouraging individuals. The end result for this person in verse 27, they become an adversary. They become an enemy of God. Verses 30 through 31, for we know him who said, vengeance is mine. I will repay, and again the Lord will judge his people. Verse 31 it is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. We know vengeance belongs to the Lord. Therefore, for those who reject Jesus, it will be a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Now you're going to fall into his punishment. It is his vengeance. But what's the encouragement for us? What will help us to remain steadfast and faithful? Verse 32. This is the encouragement part of it. But remember the former days when after being enlightened, you endured a great conflict of suffering, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. Verse 34, for you showed sympathy to the prisoners and accepted joyfully the seizure of your property, knowing that you have for yourselves a better possession and an abiding one. This morning in Bible class, if you weren't here, I believe there's many dangers in a Christian's life. There's many things that can harm us or hurt us spiritually. But in my opinion, I think there's one thing in particular that is very harmful for a Christian. And I think that's forgetfulness. Not remembering what Christ has done. In verse 32, he says, remember your former days when you received the knowledge of the truth and you endured afflictions. Verse 35, he says, therefore do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. Verse 36, for you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. Our confidence now, don't cast it away, the confidence we have in this sacrifice, in Jesus. Don't cast that away. Remember what Christ has done. Look forward to his return. Don't cast away what he's done and draw near. Do the lettuce because of the sacrifice. And now build up your endurance so that you can overcome the persecutions you face and receive the promise of salvation of your soul. Let's read the final 3 verses. For yet in a little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back to destruction, but of those who have faith to the preserving of the soul. I have confidence this morning also in you, that we are not of the number who shrink back and turn back to destruction. But we are of the number who believe into the saving of the soul. And I understand completely that we don't struggle with turning back to Judaism. But what do we struggle with? Turning back to past sins? Turning back to the way we used to live? Turning back to our former lust, which was in our ignorance? But remembering Christ and being enlightened of the work that he's done will help us to remain steadfast until he returns or until we're called up. That's what will help us to encourage others to love and good works. Remembering Jesus and how great his sacrifice was for us. Remembering the blessings in the New Testament, in Jesus' body and through his blood, that we have sanctification, perfection, forgiveness of sins, entrance into the holiest, and the salvation of the soul. These are the things that will help us in our times of temptation and persecution. If someone asks you, what is chapter 10 of Hebrews about? It's the insufficiency of the Old Testament, the sufficiency of the New Testament and Jesus, what our proper response should be in encouraging others, having confidence in our high priest. And then there's a punishment for those who reject Christ, who are a discouragement. And this punishment belongs to God. It's in his hands. So how do we encourage one another? By remembering Christ, what he's done for us, his work, his life, and then looking forward to his return. So when someone asks you what it's about, I hope that we know how to respond to them, that we can encourage those or tell those what Christ has done. If you're here this morning and you don't know what Christ has done, there are plenty of people in this congregation who would be willing to study with you, who would be willing to walk through the scriptures of the New Testament to show you what he's done, to show you of the shadow that he was in the Old Testament, and then to explain and show you the substance of the New. If you've never become a Christian, we invite you, we encourage you to come down, to set up a Bible study with someone, and to become a Christian having your sins washed away in baptism, and to be resurrected into a new life, and begin the process and the progress of maturity spiritually. If you've turned back, if you have been a person that has shrunk back, if you've forgotten what Christ has done for you in your life, if you're no longer looking for that return and you find yourself almost fearful, and I think I've shared this with the congregation before, but I had a friend who, in working on a shed, he heard his other friends say that the Lord was returning, and he actually ran fearful. He went and hid. That is a true story. He went and hid himself. He wasn't excited. He wasn't looking forward to that return. He had forgotten. And so this morning, if you have forgotten what Christ has done for you, we encourage you to get your life right again with Christ and to begin that path of maturity again, to be on the right way, to live righteously with God. If you haven't done that, we encourage you to come forward this morning as we stand and sing.
On behalf of the Lawnville Road Church of Christ, I want to thank you for joining us today for our worship. If you ever have an opportunity, we invite you to join us at our physical location at 1301 Lawnville Road in Kingston, Tennessee. We hope you will come and experience the simplicity of New Testament Christianity to learn about God and to become a part of His family. If you have questions, if you would like to know more about the Bible, or if you would like a home Bible study, feel free to contact us by calling 865-717-0444. Or for more information, please visit our website at www.lawnvilleroadcoc.org. Again, we thank you, and we hope you have a blessed day.